Right. So we're just gonna go ahead and get things started. People that are later than 4 or 5 minutes can, well, just not get the beginning of this, which is totally fine. I'll talk a little bit about myself. I'll talk a little bit about why we're doing this, and then we'll go ahead and dive into some PHP. This is only an hour long, so we're not going to get very far. So if you know a lot of this stuff already, I apologize. This is only an intro. However, with that said, as you can see here on the left-hand side, it says upcoming workshops, 2020 workshop series 1 to 3, learn JavaScript and jQuery this summer. This is already ended. We did not do this. However, we're going to do another workshop series exactly like this one in the fall, except instead of being about JavaScript and jQuery, it's going to be all about PHP and how to use PHP to build custom WordPress themes and plugins. So if you're interested in learning way more about PHP after this, it'll be a 9-hour total workshop series. So it'll be 3 days, 3 hours each day. And so stay tuned to WP Omaha. You can join us in our meetup group at meetup.com/WP-Omaha. I will put that in the chat. And then also WPOmaha.org is another place to find out a lot of stuff about us. And that is actually where the registration for that workshop series will be. And yeah, and so if you want to learn more about PHP after this, you will learn a whole lot more at that workshop series. And we will dive into great detail. You will go from beginner to at least intermediate in those 9 hours, I can guarantee it. Cool. So with that said, my name is Rob Ruiz. Here's my LinkedIn profile. I'll copy that, also put that in the chat for you. And yeah, basically, I am a WordPress software engineer currently at Proxybid, which is a local auction software company. I've been a WordPress developer now for about 6 or 7 years now. And I've been doing web development for a solid 15. I've been doing PHP for about 10 years. And so, yeah, I know this stuff basically inside and out. I lead this local group, WP Omaha. I do a lot of the talks through there. Also, if you're interested in learning more just through what the talks that we've done are, you can go to youtube.com and search for WP Omaha. And I will share the link to our channel in the chat as well. And we have a lot of content in there, basically recordings of previous meetups that we've done, along with some other stuff. So feel free to go ahead and check some of this stuff out if you want to learn more about WordPress, WordPress development, and whatever the topics are of these videos. But yeah, so that's what I do. I'm about 38 years old. Been doing this for a while. I'm completely self-taught. No, I do not have a degree in IT. My background originally is in public relations advertising. I have a bachelor's degree in public relations advertising, and then I got into graphic design and web design right out of college. And I did mostly graphic design for the first, I would say, 6 to 7 years of my career right out of college. And then I got hardcore into DJing, and I was a professional DJ after the crash of 2008 when I couldn't find a job. And then after that, I ended up going full on into web development with WordPress. And so, yeah, it's been a solid, I think it was around 2012. I started building people's websites in WordPress. And so, yeah, it's been about 8 years with WordPress. 8 years building websites, about 7 years developing stuff from scratch for websites, for WordPress. So that's a little bit about me. If you have any other questions about me later after the fact, you can go ahead and add me on LinkedIn, send me a message. Also, you can send me messages through our meetup group. If you basically, if you go to members, I think you can message the organizers of the group. Those messages go to me. Also, we have a few contact forms on WP Omaha. If you go to contact us, there's a form on there. Those also go to me as well. So if you have any questions after this, I'll be happy to answer them. That's all I've got for now. Yeah, let's go ahead and jump into it. There's a Q&A section. So if at any point in time during this you have any questions, I'll be happy to slow it down, answer any questions that you got at that current point in time. Yeah, don't be afraid to ask questions. I would love to answer them for you. So without further ado, let's do some PHP. But before we do that, let's kind of understand exactly what we're looking at right now. Obviously, this is what's referred to as an IDE on the right side of my screen. That's basically a fancy acronym for a editor to edit code in. So to write code in, edit code in, whatnot. I use the editor PHP Storm. It is almost the same as IntelliJ, and it is by the people called JetBrains. They make fantastic IDEs for many different programming languages. PHP Storm is just essentially a specialized version of WebStorm, which is their generic IDE that they make. And you can essentially use PHP Storm to not only write PHP, but write any language actually. So don't get confused in that. But yeah, if you're wondering what IDE I'm using, it's PHP Storm. And then on the left-hand side of the screen here, you're basically seeing a blank page. But it's not just a blank page, just so everybody's aware, and for people that don't know a lot about about WordPress, don't freak out too much. We're not going to be going into WordPress itself hardcore. I'm only using WordPress as a playground to, demo this custom PHP. But for those that are curious, this is a local installation where I am using Local by Flywheel. This is what Local by Flywheel looks like right here. It's a little site I spun up called DoSpace. And then we have a theme activated, and in that theme, I went into the page.php file, which is that's what gets fired whenever it loads any page. And I essentially just cleared out everything. I just removed all of the code from the PHP or page.php file in the theme, in the core theme itself, in the actual parent theme, which you're not ever supposed to do. So don't do as I do as I say. Yeah, so I know you're not normally supposed to do this, but I only did it here just because we're demonstrating just how to write PHP generically, and this is the easiest way for me to spin up a local PHP environment. So right now, what we're looking at here is a blank page because there's nothing being loaded, and then we've got some PHP tags, and then we've got some comments here that are basically stuff for you to read while you're waiting to join or while waiting for this thing to get kicked off. And so hold on a second. I see a question. PHP is used mainly for front end or more back end uses. That's a great question. Okay, so PHP is primarily a templating engine, is what it was originally designed to be, something like 25 years ago, I think, when it was made. Or maybe it's 15 years. I can't remember exactly. I feel like it's 25, but I could be wrong. Anyway, it's a templating engine. Now, I say templating engine, and you might think, okay, well, that sounds like the front end. It is a server-side language. So essentially what's happening here is that when the user uses a browser to request a web page from a server, what happens is that the server runs PHP on it and uses PHP to essentially construct HTML. And then it returns in the response from that request what it rendered. So you use it to create like front end views, I guess. You use it to generate HTML to some degree, which is a front end language, but all of that generation happens on the server itself, on the back end. So you make a request for a page, PHP runs, says, okay, let me figure out all this logic, let me build all of this HTML for you, and then what it builds, the result of that PHP construction, ends up responding back to the user's browser, just like this page here. So this page, the WP Omaha website, is obviously built on WordPress. That would be weird if it wasn't. And so PHP is doing a whole bunch of stuff in the background when we call the page, and it puts together all the HTML and sends it to us. And it'll make a little bit more sense here later once we start actually doing some code in PHP. But one of the first confusing things that I want to dispel to people when they first start using PHP is a lot of people think that when you're writing stuff in a PHP file, that you're only limited to writing PHP. And that is completely untrue. So a little unknown fact by people that don't know a lot about PHP yet is that you can write completely valid HTML inside of any PHP file. So we can go ahead and say H1, and we can say welcome to intro to PHP by do space. Click save on this, refresh this page over here, and you can see now we have an H1 tag up here. So what's fun about PHP is that you get to kind of sprinkle in this back-end logic with normal HTML like you would write in a .html file. And we can do it as much as we want. We can do some HTML, and then we can write some more PHP in here. And so in this PHP, I'll go ahead and say echo, and then we could say, you know, here is an example of some actual PHP. Semicolon at the end of that. We'll go over this syntax here in a minute. And I'm just going to wrap this in like a p tag so that it's valid HTML. And so it separates itself from the header. And so if we inspect element on this page, we can kind of get an idea of what is the HTML final result of what we just wrote. So notice how there's really no difference between what I did here with the H1 tag and what I did here with the P tag. Let me increase the size of that here a little bit because I know my screen is very high resolution, and I just want to make sure you guys can read the inspect tool down there. Yeah, notice how we could have wrote both of these in HTML and it still would have came out looking the same. We just used PHP to do the second part. So all PHP did here, all this echo command does in PHP is it says, hey, PHP, I just want you to spit out this HTML for me, or this, actually just this string. I want you to take this string, which is why it's wrapped in these quotes, right? And it doesn't matter if it's single quotes or double quotes, usually. Now there are obviously exceptions to that rule. But yeah, we can write it in double quotes or in single quotes, and it's going to do the same thing here. So all we're doing is say, hey, PHP, spit this string of text out in the HTML structure that you're currently building, and it just goes ahead and does that. Now, obviously, PHP is capable of doing much more than this, which is kind of where the value of PHP comes from. So, you know, you might be wondering at this point, well, why not just do everything in HTML? What's the point of PHP? Okay, great question. There's a lot of points of using PHP. Most of it has to do with the fact that HTML is not a programming language. In order to learn to write HTML, when you write HTML, you're not actually programming. What you're doing is you're writing markup code. And it's the simplest coding language to ever learn because it's not a programming language. So not all languages are programming languages. Some are markup languages, some are programming languages. There's no logic that happens when we write HTML. So when I say logic, I mean like we can't tell the system, hey, if the user's logged in, do this HTML, but if the user's not logged in, spit out this other HTML. We can't do that with just raw HTML. It's just not possible because HTML just doesn't do it. So we need to leverage another programming language to generate the appropriate HTML in those two scenarios. One scenario, the user's logged in. The other scenario, the user's not logged in. And so we normally use PHP on servers to do that for us, essentially. And so what that means is we're talking about conditional situations. If this, then that. That is programming. So PHP allows us to essentially leverage a real programming language to generate HTML templates for us. Now, that's what PHP originally was designed to do. However, with that said, you can use PHP to do a lot more than just generate HTML templates. Today, PHP is now capable of doing much more than that. So basically anything you could do with any backend language like Java or .NET or whatever, you can also do with PHP. PHP, you can have entire PHP files that don't even generate any HTML at all. So that might be a little confusing, and I wouldn't be surprised if it is, because PHP is a very loose language. There's no rules, and it's all runtime, so there's no compile process. So when the server runs, it reads your PHP, it does what you tell it to do, and that's it. And so you don't have to do a build process. You can read all the PHP, you can make it very human readable, and it just does whatever you tell it to do. And there's not a whole lot of rules behind it. So there's bad ways to write PHP, and there's good ways to write PHP, and the two end up giving you usually the same result. So yeah, it's a great programming language to get started learning how to actually program, because it's not strict at all. So let's learn some more PHP, shall we? First of all, you've seen the PHP tag here. So this PHP tag is extremely necessary even when you're in a .php file. So you have to explicitly tell PHP, hey, listen, I'm going to start doing PHP in this area. And when it processes your PHP code, it's important to know that it's reading it from top to bottom. So it'll start at the top processing your code, and it'll read it all the way to the bottom of your file. Why is this important? Well, because in PHP, we could do things like declare variables. So what I'm going to do is instead of just telling it to spit out this string of text right here, I'm going to actually store this string of text in a variable. So you can, if you're new to variables, you can think of a variable as a thing that you tell the program to remember. So you're just going to say, okay, I'm going to call this like example string. And I'm going to make it equal to this string, right? So now what we're doing is we're taking this string of text that we wrote, and we're storing it in this variable called example string. So now after that, if we want to then spit that string out on the page, all we have to do is say echo example string. So now when we refresh the page, we should see the exact same thing that we saw before, and in fact, we do. Because all we did was say, hey, take this, remember it in a variable, and then spit that variable out. Now, the reason I did this is because I want to show you what happens if we don't do it in the correct order. Because I just told you that this happens top to bottom. So now if we refresh the page, you'll notice that we lost our string here. That did not work. And what that actually did in the background is it generated an error. Now, we don't see that error showing up on the page because WordPress currently is set to hide all the errors. But nevertheless, it didn't work. So let's put that back where we had it before, because again, PHP is procedural, so you do have to respect the top to bottom approach. So don't try to use variables before you've declared what they are and what they should contain. So now we've basically shown off how to use variables and how to use the echo command. And the echo command is not the only way to print stuff out on the page. There's also another command, which is a function instead of a command. Oh, whoops, I didn't mean to write function, sorry. I meant to write the actual function I was talking about. So this function is called printr, and we can use printr to print out our string. So that's another way we could do it. However, printr does stuff that echo doesn't. I'll demonstrate that in a little while. I don't want to get too confusing here. But let's talk about some data types, because there are lots of different types of data that we can store in a variable, right? So we're going to start talking about, let's see, what is our example thing? Let's talk about musical instruments. I am obsessed with music, and I love musical instruments. So I was in band for a long time in my life. I know a lot about musical instruments. So we're just going to create a variable called musical instruments. And if you learned any other kind of code, you're probably looking at this underscore separation instead of the camel case jammed together like JavaScript does, like this. Okay. Can you do it this way? Yes. Will you get mocked by PHP developers for doing it that way? Yes. I didn't create these standards, I guess, the standard way of creating variables, the camel case versus the underscores and stuff like that. It's not my choice. I actually know how to program both ways. But in PHP land, for whatever reason, somebody along the line decided that this is the way we do it in PHP. And so I just follow that convention. Also, I know I didn't explicitly point this out, but the $ is how you create variables. And you can call them whatever you want. So in this case, I'm just calling it musical instruments. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create what's called an array. Now, there's a couple of different ways to create an array in PHP. And the first one is just like this. You say array, open close parentheses, and then you start filling these parentheses with a comma delimited list of things that you want to be in the array. That's one way of doing it. I'll show you that way right now. So we could go ahead and say, okay, one musical instrument is the saxophone. This is my instrument that I learned growing up. Another cool instrument, I guess, for many people is the guitar. That's a cool musical instrument. I'm a huge fan of drums. I love drums. I don't know how to play them, at least on a drum set, but I do use drum machines to create drum patterns. And then, of course, the infamous piano, right? That is one of the oldest musical instruments. So now we've created a legit array. This is one way to do it. Another way to do it is to, you can just use the brackets. Like so. And this is another way to create the same exact array. So I just loaded this variable up with the exact same value twice, just two different ways. That's the result of what I just wrote. So now let's see what happens when we try to echo out our array. And if you're not familiar with what an array is just a list of things, a list of data, essentially. And arrays exist in almost all programming languages. So now if we try to echo out our musical instruments, you can see all it does is say, array. Look, this is an array. Yeah, that's very helpful, PHP. Thank you very much. That's not what we were expecting. We kind of just wanted to see exactly what we have over here, not just have you tell us that it's an array. So what we'll do instead is use print R. And this is kind of the big difference between print R and echo, is that when we print our stuff out, it will actually show us what we expected to see when it comes to arrays and objects and all sorts of other crazy stuff. So you can see in this situation, it says array, but then it also tells us what's in the array, which is super handy. Now, I'll show you guys another quick little trick, because when you're first starting to learn PHP, it's very handy to constantly have PHP tell you what is stored in certain variables or in certain objects or whatever, right? It's very, very handy to have it tell you what's going on behind the scenes in the process of doing all the stuff that it's doing. This print R is not a very easy way to read an array. So if you want an easier way to read an array, here's my little trick. We can tell it to echo out what's called a pre-element in HTML. So this is a legit valid HTML element. Many people don't know that it's a real HTML element and not part of PHP because most people just don't use this element. But I find it extremely useful in this scenario, and you'll see why right now. So in my opinion, that is a lot easier to read than what we saw previously, especially if you're talking about an array that has like 100 items or something in it. It can be quite cumbersome to read it the other way. So just a little pro tip, whenever you're trying to spit out arrays or objects or data on the screen that PHP is working on at any given time, you can just basically do an echo on both sides of the print R and just say, hey, echo start a pre-element, then spit out your print R, and then end that pre-element. So we're wrapping our array that it's spitting out in this element, and that automatically formats it in this nice, pretty way that's easy for us to read. So, so that's nice. It's all good and fine and fun. Maybe a little bit boring for some people, We'll get to more interesting stuff here in a second, especially when you start talking about putting arrays inside of arrays or objects inside of arrays, then things get real interesting. Now, that's two data types. So we talked about a string. This is a string data type. Another common data type, is an integer or something, right? So we could say like example. I'm not going to write out the whole word example because I'm lazy. Number 3. Okay, cool. So we can use integers, and we could say, okay, actually that kind of looks weird. I'm gonna change that. Depends on how you read that. So example number equals 3, and then we could just say, okay, example number. Instead of printing out this array, let's just print out our example number, and you can see it just spits out 3. So if you've learned other strict languages like Java or .NET, there's many out there, C#, C++, all these things, right? Normally you have to tell it what type of value you're going to store in the variable. So you might see stuff like, integer or something like that. Then you assign your value or whatever. You don't need to do that in PHP. Again, I said PHP is a very loose language. It's not strict at all. So you could just tell it to store whatever you want it to store, and it'll figure out the type of value on its own. You don't have to explicitly say, hey, I'm going to make a variable, and it's going to be this type of data, and now here it is, it's 3. It'll figure it out on its own. So if we did this, it'll know automatically that it's a string, and if we leave it like this, it'll know automatically that it's an integer. So that's cool, great. What are some other types of data? I don't know. There's integers, numbers, booleans, right? So a boolean, true or false, right? So let's go ahead and say example boolean equals true. Now this will be interesting. What do you expect to see when I print this boolean out? I'm sure you're probably expecting to have it tell you true, but it doesn't. It just tells you 1, because that's just what PHP does. So if something is true, it'll spit out 1, and then if it's false, it just won't show anything. The equivalent to 0, but yeah, it just won't spit anything out at all. So it's a good little thing to know. We could store Boolean values like true or false in a variable, integers in a variable, strings in a variable. Basically anything, any type of data can be stored in a variable, and you don't have to explicitly say what type of variable it is. So that's cool, awesome. Let's go on to something a little bit more interesting, like actual logic. All right, so earlier I talked about the situation where, like, okay, is the user logged in, then show this. If they're not, then show something else, right? So that's called a conditional. And so we will go ahead and show off how to do a conditional in PHP. So I'm going to go ahead and not spit this out anymore. And then how we do this is what's called an if statement. Now, it could also be an if else, and I'll show that off in a second right now. But just hang tight. Start with one thing at a time. So we're going to use our example bool here to determine whether or not the user's logged in. Now, you're going to have to use your imagination here a little bit. I know it just says example bool. If you want me to rename it to is user logged in, we could do that too. There you go. So if is user logged in, then echo out welcome user. Okay, cool. Let's do that. Refresh the page, and we see no welcome user. And the reason is that this thing is false. It's telling us right now the user's not logged in. So, of course, we would not expect it to actually perform this line of code because this conditional did not evaluate to true. So let's go ahead and change this to true and say, okay, well, the user is logged in. Boom. Now we see welcome user. So if we wanted to do this a little bit more interestingly, we could do an if else statement. And we could say, okay, well, if the user's logged in, then welcome the user. Otherwise, say, you're not logged in. Probably wondering why I changed it from double quotes to single quotes. This is why. Because I wanted to be grammatically correct when I said your. I could have just said you are, but you get the idea. So there you go. So right now, we're not logged in because this is set to false. So if we change that to true, then it says, hey, welcome user. Cool. So this is a conditional. And this is programming. Now it's a very simple way of programming, and programming gets much more technical than this. But this is definitely an important part of programming. So let's kind of talk about what an if statement actually is down to its core. Okay, so what we're looking at is anytime you see a statement followed by open close parentheses, what this actually is behind the scenes is a function. So what is a function? Let's talk about what a function actually is. Well, first of all, we can write a function by just typing function, and we could just give it any name that we want, just like we did with the variables, except we don't do $sign, no $sign. Dollar signs are only for variables. And so in this case, we want to say function, my first function. And this is the normal syntax for a function. We say function, we declare the name of the function, we open close parentheses, and then we open close curly braces. Okay, that is the syntax. Now you're probably wondering, well, why not just open close the curly braces and call it good and execute your code inside of that function between the curly braces? That's because this is designed for parameters. We're just not going to use any parameters right this second. However, I will show you how to pass in parameters very soon, or arguments, if you will. Sorry, they're called arguments. Arguments, parameters, same thing. Here we say, okay, my first function, for this first function, I actually want to echo out something. Well, let's just echo out welcome user. Okay. That's all this function is going to do, is just echo out welcome user. So now, instead of putting this here, what we can actually do is say execute this function. Okay, so in order to declare a function, we put the function keyword followed by the name of the function. In order to execute a function, we just use the keyword followed by open close parentheses. Okay, so that's how that works. So now if we refresh the page, we see no change on the page because we're still set to true here. So this thing triggered and welcome user did its thing. Okay, so we wanted to make it not say the same thing. Just for your peace of mind, we could say welcome user 1. So there you go. Now it says welcome user 1 when it echoes this out. So now let's changes from my first function to something a little bit more interesting. So let's just actually call this welcome user, right? So now we say, okay, this is our welcome user function, and we're going to welcome the user. Boom. Now I've just changed those two names. No change on the page. We're good to go. Let me squeeze this in a little bit so it's not cutting off all that code there. Let's see. I see a question from Basim. You mentioned to create variables, you can use camel case 2 to create variables instead of underscore or underspace score. So yes, you can use camel case to create variables. However, it's just not common practice. Okay, that's not the convention. So I would strongly recommend that you don't. You're just, when you go reading PHP code online, you're not going to see people using it. So I would say when in Rome, do as the Romans do. When in PHP, do as the PHPians do. Yeah, so so just use underscores. The important thing is here, it has to be one solid string. So we cannot introduce spaces. That is wrong, okay? So it just needs to be one long string of characters. There could be numbers in here. Do not use special characters like and symbols or, you know, whatever percentages. Don't do any of that. Just only numbers, and I would actually, normally I stay away from doing the numbers too, to be completely honest. Try to just use like regular, you know, characters and underscores. That should be fine. Yeah, yeah. So he says I'm used to writing camel case in other programming languages like Java and JavaScript. Me too. Me too, Basim. I hear you loud and clear, man. If I was writing JavaScript, you'd see a bunch of camel case in here. But again, in PHP, for whatever reason, we do it camel case, or I'm sorry, underscore style. Now, I will say this much on the topic, because we're talking about it. PHP has a lot of similarities to JavaScript in the way that you write the code. So I personally have found it to be extremely handy that you don't use camel case, that you use underscores in PHP instead, because it makes it more obvious to me when I'm switching back and forth very frequently between PHP and JavaScript. It makes it a lot more obvious to me that I'm currently writing PHP. When you start switching back and forth a lot, it can be very easy to get the two languages confused, especially when you start seeing stuff like this, which looks a lot like JavaScript. And so I find it very handy in that scenario. So at first people get kind of annoyed by it and they're like, man, I just want to use camel case because I like camel case. I would say one benefit of not doing that is it makes it much more obvious when you're looking at the code that you're currently writing PHP and not JavaScript. So whether or not that's handy to you, I don't know. I'm sure there are many people that would argue I don't need to see the whatever camel case to know that I'm writing JavaScript or PHP. That's fine. I personally get confused quite a bit when I'm switching back and forth between the two frequently, and so I find that pretty handy. So anyway, let's move on to seeing what else we can do with functions. Okay, so we can make functions do whatever we want, right? I'm just making it spit out some text. Obviously, we can make functions do a whole bunch of crazy stuff. This would be actually a very silly usage of a function. But nonetheless, that's how we're doing. I want to keep it simple for people to understand. So let's talk about arguments, right? Commonly known as args, okay? And so we can pass arguments into a function, and that makes the function a little bit more dynamic. So now, instead of making it called args, we're gonna, and when we're declaring the function, we get to call it whatever we want. So here, I'm just gonna make it be called user name. Okay? What this does is it says, okay, whatever we pass into the parentheses when the function is called, we're gonna store that value in this variable. And then we can use this variable to concatenate in right here. And the way concatenation works in PHP as opposed to JavaScript, like what we were just talking about, is we use periods, not pluses. So in JavaScript, they use plus to concatenate things together. And if you're not familiar with the word concatenation, it basically just means that we're like shoving stuff together. We're like almost like glue. Think of the periods as glue. And so we're saying, take this string, glue it on to this, whatever gets put into this variable, and then glue that onto this exclamation point, right? So we're just kind of gluing all this stuff together with this period. And again, it's called concatenation. And we use periods to concatenate stuff in PHP. So now, when I say welcome user, this thing is already screaming at me up here. That's why this is highlighted, because it knows required parameter username is missing, right? It's required. Not all parameters are required in PHP. We could just as easily say equals, create a string here and say generic username. And now it's not screaming at me because I've given basically a default to this variable. So basically it's saying if they don't pass a value in for the parameter, then the value is just going to be generic username. So if we refresh the page, you'll see it says welcome user, generic username. Now let's just take the user part out so it makes a little bit more sense. So now it says welcome generic username. Cool. That's a little dumb. Let's not use generic username. Maybe we'll just call this like unknown user. How about that? There you go. Welcome unknown user. Okay, cool, but we know who the user is. In this case, it's me, Rob. Actually, I'll put my full name so you remember it easier. Okay? Welcome, Rob Ruiz. Cool. So we used a function. We passed in a parameter. We told it, hey, I want the username variable to be equal to this string. And so all it's doing is gluing this string into here. And now we get welcome Rob Ruiz. All right, cool. We got another question. Will you be able to cover loops in this session? Yes, we are going to go over loops. We still got 15 minutes left. Totally plan on doing that. That's why we already have an array in here. But good question, Basim. Got you covered. All right, cool. So welcome Rob Ruiz. This is all working. We've welcomed the user because theoretically we're logged in. Okay, now let's do some more fun stuff. So now that the user's logged in, let's list that user's favorite instrument. Since you were just talking about loops, let's go straight into it. I've got no problem with that. So let's see, down here, I'm gonna do, we're gonna switch it up a bit, okay? So remember when I said you can intermittently use PHP however you want? Let's just take advantage of that. Why not? So instead of you using PHP to echo some stuff out, we're just gonna use HTML. So we're just gonna say, okay, let's make a an H3 tag. We're gonna say users favorite musical instruments, and then colon space. And then we're going to create what's called an unordered list. If you don't know HTML, that's beyond the scope of this, but that's what that is. And then in here, we're going to do something else. So right now, it's going to be an empty list. Excuse me. Oh, my COVID is acting up. Sorry, guys. Take a drink real quick. Just kidding. I don't have COVID, for the record. All right, so let's go ahead and refresh the page. You can see now we say, okay, welcome Rob Ruiz. Users' favorite instruments are, and we can get even, we can get crazier than that. We can store our name in a variable, which is exactly why we use variables, so that we can use them in multiple places, right? So now we can say, well, we want this to be the user's name. And then we're going to use the user's name again down here, so it doesn't just say users. We're just going to say look at that. See, now we're getting all sorts crazy with the PHP, just, sprinkling it around all over the place. All right, so now it says Rob Ruiz's favorite musical instruments, and we're expecting to see a list of them, and we don't. It's because we haven't done what we need to do yet in order to do that. So now let's sprinkle in some more PHP. And for the record, this is extremely sloppy PHP. I'm not like trying to show you guys like the prettiest, most expert way of using PHP. When you first start writing PHP, your PHP is probably going to look quite sloppy. It's okay. Nobody's going to judge you on that. You're just learning. So please don't judge me by the looks of my PHP. And also just know that this is not what, I would consider to be like professional looking PHP. It's just simple enough for people that are new to it to understand. And so I would encourage you to go ahead and write your PHP like this when you're getting started. But obviously, once you feel comfortable with it, learn the more professional ways to write the syntax that are a little bit prettier. So, so now we're going to use what's called a loop, which is what Basim was talking about earlier. And the way we loop through arrays, in this case, in PHP, is we use what's called a for each loop. Now, there are many kinds of loops. We could use a while loop. We could use a for loop. I personally use for each loops more than anything else in PHP. So I'm going to show you my most common loop. But with that said, I do occasionally use for loops, and I do occasionally use while loops. So I won't go over those right now. I think for each is probably the easiest to understand, and so we'll just do that for now. So I'm going to say for each musical instruments, and then we tell it as, and then, and I'm using PHP Storm, so it's like smart enough to like figure out what I'm likely going to put in for the next part. And there you go. So now we've initiated a loop. And so what's happening here is the loop is a function, just like up here, except it's a function built into PHP. It's a core function of PHP. So we're telling it for each, then the first argument that we pass in is the variable or the data that we want to loop over, okay? And then we tell it as, and then we tell it what do we want each iteration over that thing to be stored as. So what's happening is it's going to loop over every single string, every single item in this array, and then it's going to store the value for that item one at a time in this variable, okay? So now what we're going to do is say, okay, now for each one of those, go ahead and echo out an li, because that's what we put inside of unordered list, is list items. And then we're going to concatenate in our musical instrument. And you might be wondering, Rob, why are you like using concatenation in some places and just ending PHP and starting HTML and then starting PHP? Why are you doing it all these crazy ways? A, because this is PHP and there's no, well, there are no hardcore rules. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. So you'll see this type of stuff commonly in other people's code. And B, I want you guys to be familiar with how you can do this type of stuff. There's two ways. We can close and open PHP tags, or we could just concatenate things together. Different strokes for different folks, different ways for different scenarios. Let's put it that way. Cool. So now what we're going to see when we refresh the page is a fancy list of all of our instruments. So again, basically what it's doing is it's loading each one of these strings into this musical instrument variable one at a time as it loops through this list of instruments, and then allows me to do whatever I want with that variable inside of this open close curly braces. Okay, so again, for each is just a function. It's just a core function of PHP. And within this function, we can do all kinds of things, like declare other variables, or just spit out text on a page, or whatever, right? So this is just a very simple loop, about as simple as it gets. So that's how we loop over things in PHP. Again, there's other ways to do it. You can do while loops, for loops. For anybody who's familiar with JavaScript, like you, Basim, it sounds like, the syntax for a for loop and a while loop are fairly spot on to exactly what they are in JavaScript. So for a while loop, we would do while, some condition, then down here, yada, yada, yada. You know, same thing with the for loop, for I equals 1, or no, what is it, greater than, whatever, 10 or something. And then we say I plus plus to iterate, right? So same type of thing as JavaScript, whoops. Same type of thing as JavaScript. Syntax is almost identical. It doesn't like my I because I doesn't exist. So we would have to say like for musical instruments, I think, right? No, we would still say I. I think we have to say I equals, tell it where to start. So I equals 1, then I plus plus. And I don't know why it's barking at me for this, but I know the syntax is pretty much spot on. I guess we would say less than 10. I don't know. Is this supposed to be plus equals? I don't know what the problem is there. I'm not going to go into it, but because we're running out of time. So yeah, it's about the same as JavaScript. So that's how we do the for each loop. So loops are very common in programming. Basically what we're doing is we're saying, hey, here's a whole bunch of data, and it's a list of data. I want you to go through each piece of that data and do a bunch of stuff with it, essentially. So this is like a few like really good examples of like basic programming, you know, loops, functions, variables, conditional statements. I mean, that's mostly the basics. Now, obviously, we could do math in some of these scenarios. So I'll show you a little bit of math. So let's do this here. We could say how many favorite instruments this is. So like right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say instrument count equals count musical instruments. The count function is a core function of PHP and will look at an array and tell you how many elements in the array that there are. Similar to in JavaScript when you say .length on an array. Same type of thing. This will count how many are in the array. And then so what we could do with this count is we could say Rob Ruiz's and then it'll just tell us how many are in the array. So you can see it says Rob Ruiz's 4 favorite musical instruments are saxophone, guitar, drums, and piano. However, I have more favorite musical instruments than that, just so you know, everybody. So I'm going to say, okay, my other favorite musical instrument is the, totally making this up as I go, guys, sorry, apologize. Trying to think of a good one that I really like. You know what I really like that are not used enough at all? Shakers. Shakers are awesome. So now watch what happens now that I've changed my array of instruments. Notice how it now changed the 4 to 5, and we have shakers at the bottom. And so this is the power of PHP, is that it is extremely dynamic, meaning that when you don't know what things are going to be, you could just store them in a variable and say, look, I don't care what the actual value is going to be. Just take whatever that value is and put it here, right? And it'll do it. And so it's a beautiful thing. It'll just, you know, it's all about being dynamic. It's about as little static stuff as possible. Now, obviously, there's some static stuff here. You're not logged in, blah, blah, blah. If we say, hey, I'm not logged out or not logged in, you know, we don't see the welcome thing. It says I'm not logged in. And, you know, what we could do if we wanted to make sure that it doesn't show all the favorite instruments unless I'm logged in is we could just go ahead and say, well, look, man, if the user's not logged in, then don't do any of this. So watch how this works. If is user logged in, now notice how there's all this end PHP, and then we got HTML, we're starting PHP, ending PHP, starting PHP, ending PHP, whatever, yeah. We can do that till we're blue in the face, and it doesn't care. Watch what happens when I just do this. Now, I made things a little ugly, a little uglier than I expected, to be completely honest. But that's okay. So now, it's even smart enough, PHP Storm is even smart enough to tell me which curly brace is the start curly brace for this end curly brace. And so notice how PHP is smart enough to know, even though I've turned off and on PHP a bunch of times, it knows that this is the start of the curly brace for the conditional, and this is the end one, meaning that all of the stuff in between here will only show up if the user is logged in. So right now, wait, hold on, what happened? Oh, it's false, duh. So it says you're not logged in, so we don't see any of this stuff. I don't know why I was expecting something different there for a second. I apologize. Yeah, so now if we tell it true and we refresh the page, we see all of our stuff. The didgeridoo, that's a good one. Man, how did I know somebody was going to bring that up? It's all about the percussion instruments today, guys. The didgeridoo, that is a good one. Thank you for bringing that one up, Pat. He's always good on the quips. There we go. Now I have 6 favorite musical instruments, and it's also in our list automatically. Cool, cool, cool. So it's 7:29. This thing was supposed to start at 6:30, so it's been exactly an hour. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and conclude the basics of PHP here. Now, obviously, PHP goes way deeper than this. If you want to learn more about PHP, again, I highly recommend you stay tuned to WP Omaha and hear when we're going to do our PHP workshop series in the fall. It's not scheduled yet, so I'm not sure exactly when it's going to be. My guess is it'll probably be during the month of October. That's my guess. Historically, we've done it during the month of October. I might have a reason for doing it in September. I doubt it, but let's just assume for now it's going to be in October sometime. So yeah, so that will be a lot more information about PHP than this. I mean, we'll go over the basics in that too for like the first hour, but then we'll have another 2 hours that day to go far beyond what you've seen here, and not to mention the other 2 days, which will be another 6 hours of instruction there. So that's as far as we're going to take the basics here today. Now, if you want to see, I'll kind of show you something real quick, end with like a little finale while you guys think of some questions, because I do want to field some questions and answers. But if I open up my project here, I've got another file that was the original code for this page. So I'm just going to go ahead and plop this in here so you can kind of see what like some real PHP does in the confines of WordPress. And I might even quickly go through this code and kind of explain like what's going on here. But when we refresh this page, you'll see it actually does a lot more than that simple stuff that I was writing. And that's because there's a lot more going on in here than what I wrote. So like just this get header and get footer, these two functions alone do a ton of stuff. If we were to follow the rabbit hole down to what this function does, this function calls some other functions, and then that function, those functions call other stuff, and you know, it's functions calling functions calling functions. And so it gets kind of crazy because WordPress is quite a robust network of PHP files. So here you could see that they're just declaring a layout. We got a bunch of HTML. We're adding the layout as a class dynamically in there. And then we're using the title. And so it's automatically printing out the title of the page there. And then it's doing a check, looping through posts, spitting out the content for each one. And then here's some picture of me. That's what I look like, everyone. And then some list items, which is part of the content of the page in WordPress. And then we've got this thing here that basically is a function that I think it's a WordPress function, and it just sets up the linking of some pages. And I think that is what's happening. Honestly, I don't know where that's occurring. And then we have the comments template. There's no comments on here, so it's not showing anything. And then we have the sidebar. So basically the sidebar is the contents of what's going on down here, and all that is dynamic as well. And that's it. And so if I wanted to, like, you know, sprinkle whatever I wanted in here, I totally have the ability to at my own discretion. So if I want to say like, hey, before you spit out the content, let's just go ahead and declare that, you know, this is an amazing picture of Rob Ruiz. And there you go. Tells you right there. It's an amazing picture of me at a records shop here in front of a bunch of records because I'm a DJ and I'm a nerd like that. And there you go. So PHP gets really vast. There's a lot to learn. And the most important thing to know is that in PHP files, you can write HTML and PHP intermittently, where in regular HTML files, you cannot do that. That's why building websites with PHP is far superior than building websites with just static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's see here. Basim, I think it will be great to do more PHP workshops during September. Cool. Well, I look forward to you go ahead and signing up for our workshop series. It will cost money, just so you know. The usual price for our workshop series is $75 if you do all 3 classes. Otherwise, it's $30 per day. So yeah, it essentially ends up being like $10 per hour. If you buy it per day. Now, if you buy all 3 together and you just buy all 9 hours all at once, register for all 9 hours, you get a deductions like a discount or whatever. And so it'll only cost $75 instead of the $90 that it would normally cost. So we've been doing the workshop series for about 3 years now. And basically the way that works is we need to have at least 10 people, no, at least 5 people to register for the workshop series in order for it to actually happen. And so with the JavaScript one this summer, we only had 2 people register. And so that's why we didn't do the JavaScript workshop series, unfortunately. But yeah, if we can get at least 5 people for the PHP one, we will be doing a PHP workshop series in the fall. And we will go far beyond the basics of PHP. And not only beyond we'll go beyond PHP altogether. We will go actually into the core of WordPress and basically learning how to write custom WordPress plugins, custom WordPress themes, how to alter, manipulate WordPress themes, and how to use PHP to do all sorts of crazy things with WordPress, essentially. Cool, cool. And you're very welcome, Basim. Thank you for joining. There's no other questions. I'm going to just go ahead and open it up for some more questions. I highly suggest that you guys all chime in with the questions. No question is too dumb. So if you have any question like, hey, I don't understand what this means, I don't understand that, do not be afraid to ask those kinds of questions. I am very happy to go over anything that anyone did not understand. Waiting for questions. Boom. Okay. No. Don't see any questions. Thank you, Rob. Looking forward to the PHP workshop. Thank you, Richard. Looks like we got a lot of WP Omaha people in this meetup, so that's cool. Thank you, WP Omaha, for showing up strong. Richard, Tony, Pat, Orion, Chris. I know you guys are all WP Omaha members. If there's anybody that I missed that I'm not familiar with, I apologize. But those are the ones I'm familiar with. Oh, Kristen, great question. CSS Zen Garden helps to see how to use CSS. Is there anything like that for PHP? Absolutely. Great question. So the main one I always talk about with everybody, because it's, I mean, pretty common, is W3 Schools here. So you just go to w3schools.com and they have something in there for everyone, including PHP. So you just go to Learn PHP, and here they'll send you through a little exercise, much like I just sent you through. And so you can go to W3 Schools to learn a wide variety of languages, including PHP. Now, PHP itself has its own website, php.net. And so in here, you can find documentation around all things PHP. I don't know if they have like a tutorial type of thing in here, to be completely honest, but I do know that this is where all of the built-in PHP functions are all like documented, essentially. I don't know why we're not seeing the menus, because my screen size is too small. I feel like there should be a menu in here. More document, view online English. Here we go. Boom. So yeah, it's quite extensive in here. They go through a bunch of different stuff. Syntax, types, variables. We discussed some of that today. Constants, we did not discuss. Expressions, no, we did not discuss that. Operators, we did not discuss. I guess we didn't really discuss control structures. We did discuss functions. We definitely didn't go over class objects. There's some other stuff we didn't go through in here. I don't see anything about loops. Nothing about loops in here. Nope. Nope. What are the loops? I don't know where that would be found in here, but I'm sure there's an area in here that talks about loops as well. But yeah, anyway, php.net /manual, and then whatever your preferred languages is, it's how you get to the actual PHP manual. So good question. Let's see, Rick Jones, I got interrupted. Can you tell me how I get more info on the workshop? Absolutely. So again, stay tuned to wpomaha.org. This page will change once we schedule it. However, if you want to be notified once that change happens, please join our meetup group at meetup.com/wp-omaha. There's a link to it in the chat. If you scroll up in the chat, I think you should be able to see chats from earlier. If you got in late, However, I'll go ahead and put it in here again. And if you join our Meetup group, so if you create an account on Meetup and join, I do send messages out to the entire community, all 860 of us now, when I do things like announce that registration is open for the next workshop series, along with other things that have to do with WP Omaha as well, like WordCamp Omaha, upcoming meetups, things around organization of the group, so on and so forth. Let's see. Tony, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. Awesome. Rick Jones, I look forward to, I hope to see you at the next PHP workshop series. Oh, thanks so much, Kristen. Actually, it's interesting you mentioned that because we're going to go ahead and do an outro as well. So there you go. So here's the outro music. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this little intro to PHP. Again, my name is Rob Ruiz. I'm the lead organizer of WP Omaha, and you'll be hearing a lot more from me through DoSpace. I will be doing a lot more talks about WordPress and PHP through DoSpace. As a matter of fact, I believe the next Code Camp series is going to be on WordPress, and I will have a lot to do with that. So stay tuned to WP Omaha. Stay tuned to the DoSpace emails and the DoSpace calendar, and I look forward to seeing you all at upcoming webinars, and hopefully in the near future, if COVID eventually decides to take a chill pill, in person, at an in-person meetup at DoSpace, which is where WP Omaha has historically done all of its in-person meetups for the last, I don't know, 2 years, I think, 2 or 3 years or so. If anybody has any other questions, I'll stick around for a little while until people drop off. Otherwise, thanks again for joining, and have a great weekend, folks. Orion, you didn't go over the loops? Or you want me to go over the loops? Can you go over the loop? Oh, do you mean like the loop in WordPress? Like the actual function called the loop? Is that what we're talking about? Like this right here? Cool, cool. Let's go over it. So this is basically a for each loop. And so what we do is this is a basic PHP function in WordPress. And so it takes, basically it only takes one argument, but then you have to use the as key symbol to declare the variable you're going to use to store each iteration of the loop. So, so the first thing we do is we say, well, what are we trying to loop over? And so in this case, it's our musical instruments array that you see up here. So we're saying loop over the musical instruments array, and then make each iteration, so each value in that array, so that means everything that's separated by a comma here, turn each one of those, like store each one of these strings in this variable called musical instrument that I'm declaring right now. And then inside of there, we can refer to each thing in this array, each string, as musical instrument. And so the first time we go over it, it's going to be saxophone. The second time it loops over it, it's going to be guitar. The third time it loops over it, musical instrument is going to be equal to drums, so on and so forth, all the way through the array. Does that answer your question? Cool. I'm going to take the gotcha as a yes. That's right. Yeah, because I wrapped it in the LI, it added each one as a list element. And if you want to, it might help you to see what the actual resulting code looks like. So here's what the resulting code looks like in HTML. So hopefully that helps to understand as well. See, so it just says LI, saxophone, and LI, just like we did in here. You're very welcome, Orion. I appreciate you joining us. At this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and I'll see you next time.